Very warm welcome to our Reading Week seminar this week. After three external speakers, we have our own speaker today, Shuang, Chen, or Yo-Yo, will be talking today. Yo-Yo is our new assistant professor in the department. Hopefully everybody knows that. Cough, cough. She joined us from Princeton, where she did her PhD in the demography and social policy program there. She has a particular interest in fertility and education inequalities, and her talk is very much about that. So the impact of education on fertility behaviors in China specifically. And I couldn't take much more of the time, but hand over to you, and we have our fingers crossed that the clicker works. Anyway, thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you for the opportunity to share my research in person. I can't remember the last time I did an in-person presentation. I also thank you for taking your time off the reading period to come to my presentation in person and remotely. So today, my talk is titled The Positive Effects of Women's Education on Fertility in Low-Fertility China. So in this research, I asked a question: does more education reduce women's fertility? You might think that there has already been tons of research doing that, and actually, whether it's in developing countries or developed countries, there's pervasive evidence that more educated women have lower fertility. However, this does not mean that more education reduces women's fertility. So correlation does not imply causation. For particular reasons in this context, first of all, we know that higher and lower educated women could differ in unobserved ways that determine both their education decisions and fertility decisions. At the same time, we also know that more education is not only a cause, but also a consequence of lower fertility. So both the unobserved heterogeneity and the reverse causality mean that this correlation would at least have overestimated the negative effects of women's education on fertility. That also means that if we take this correlation literally to mean causation, it would lead to very misleading policy implications. And in fact, it's not uncommon to see people do that and to suggest policies like, let's shorten the years of education, etc., etc. And actually there are surprisingly few studies providing causal evidences, and the few causal studies have actually generated very mixed results from negative, no effect to positive effects. So in this study, my goal is to provide new causal evidence on the effects of women's education on fertility and in a low fertility developing country context. So the context of my study is low fertility China, by which I mean since the early 1990s, the total fertility rate in China has declined and remained below 2.1, the replacement level, which might have come as a surprise to people who don't follow this literature. So here I'm showing the UN estimate, which put the latest TFR at 1.69, which is actually about the average of Western Europe TFR. However, even this number is likely an overestimate of the actual fertility. Depending on the sources, you see even lower estimates. So not only is the fertility low, China might even be in the lowest low fertility countries. So during the same period when fertility has declined and remained low, another major trend in China is the really rapid growth in women's educational opportunities in China. So here, for example, we show the gross enrollment rate at the secondary level. Actually, within only 2 decades, women's enrollment rate at secondary level has jumped from about 30% all the way to 88%. And here I also plot the dashed line for men's attainment. And you can see that with the rapid growth in women's education, we also see gender gap closing at the primary and the secondary level. And similar to many OECD countries, at the tertiary level, we even see women surpassing men in their tertiary attendance. However, while women are experiencing rapidly growing educational opportunities, what's also happening in this period is actually they are faced with increasing disadvantages in the labor market relative to men. And this disadvantage is shown in various measures of labor market outcomes, including participation, earnings, occupational segregation. They all kind of gotten worse in absolute terms, but also worse relative to men's outcome. Meanwhile, at home, we see that the traditional gender ideologies and gender division of labor have remained unchanged and in some cases actually worsened during this period. And this further exacerbates the labor market disadvantages women face and further intensify the work-family conflict that they face. So I'm asking, what is the effect of increased women's education on fertility in this context of low fertility China? Particularly, my study is set between 2010 to 2012. This is a time when low fertility had persisted already for almost 2 decades in China. Even though it was actually right before the official phasing out of the one-child policy, we know that a large proportion of the Chinese population at that time was already permitted to have 2 or 3 children. Also in this study, to try to get at the causal effects of women's education, I used China's higher education expansion as a natural experiment. So I will explain the strategy in more detail later. So this is just a timeline showing the various policy reforms happening after my study period. So my study is not contaminated by the policy changes in the period follow the study period. So how do we think about the mechanisms linking women's education and fertility? So here I use framework adapted from Easterlin's framework on determinants of fertility. You can't see this box because the color is too light. So according to this framework, women's education affects fertility through 3 main factors. One is age at first marriage. Second is the women's demand for children. And then the last box is fertility decision making. So my study focused on the first 2 boxes, but later I'll provide some additional analysis on the 3rd box as supporting evidence. So how does education affect women's age at first marriage? So in theory, more education delays women's entry into marriage for 3 major reasons. First is a kind of a mechanical effect, thinking about with longer education enrollment, then it necessarily postpones family formation for women. The second mechanism relates back to Becker's classic economic theory of marriage, where he said that more educated women would have fewer gains from marriage, but higher costs. The fewer gains from marriage particularly come from the fact that with women's higher participation and earnings in the labor market, they should find the gendered division of labor at home to be less advantageous for them. So that's why the gains are fewer. However, we know that this framework might be outdated because in at least European countries and the US, we see that the empirical evidence show a null relationship or even a positive relationship between women's education and marriage. However, I argue that in East Asia, this theory is very much probably still holds because in East Asian societies, they're still characterized by traditional family systems with a high degree of gender role differentiation. So Becker's theory probably still applies, and empirically, we still see an association between more education and later marriage. And the third reason for education to delay women's marriage is in many of the East Asian societies, again, there's still a strong preference for women to marry up, for men to marry down. And this means that the improvement in women's status actually results in labor marriage market mismatches, particularly for high status women and low status men. So even though all three theories predict that education should delay women's marriage, the empirical evidence is very much limited to the observational correlation between women's education and age and marriage. And not surprisingly, we see that, yes, more educated women marry later, but again, it does not mean that more education causes women to marry later. And actually, very likely, this relationship is spurious too, for two particular reasons. First, literature shows us that, at least in Chinese context, parents' educational decisions about their children, especially girls, could have factored in the negative influence on their marriage prospects already. So that if you want your girl to marry early, you wouldn't want to send her to more schooling. At the same time, there are also qualitative fieldwork showing girls actually pursue more education as a very conscious strategy to avoid the early marriage prospect. And then another both of these evidence suggests that again that more and less educated girls could differ in unobserved ways before they even obtain the education. And also, we also know that increased education, again, could be a result of delayed family formation rather than a cause effect. So now, moving on to the second mechanism is education affecting fertility through the demand for children. Here, the theory predicts an ambiguous relationship. So we invoke the classic economic series, thinking about education on one hand increases women's income, allowing them to afford more children. So that's the classic income effect. So this income does not only includes women's own wage income, but also non-wage income. And a large source of the non-wage income is actually from husbands' wages, which matter more and more as we see higher educated women marrying higher educated men. But this income effect is often offset by the increased cost of children because higher wages increase women's value of time, which is basically the opportunity cost of raising children. So in theory, it implies quite an ambiguous relationship on whether education will increase or decrease women's demand for children. But empirical evidence in the early days quite consistently show a negative relationship between the two, suggesting that this substitution effect dominates. But it's important to note that this negative relationship is observed when women often must choose between working and raising children. And if we examine the more recent literature, we see that this negative empirical relationship is often weakened or even reversed when child rearing does not entirely rely on women's own time anymore. And a classic example is the access to childcare services. Specifically, if we have access to childcare service, it means that from a woman's perspective, it changes the structure of the cost of child rearing. So in this case, with higher education or higher wages, it still increases the value of women's time, but it does not necessarily increase the opportunity cost of raising children as much. So that's where the key difference lies. And the interesting empirical example, one is from Norway, where the researchers shows that over time, thanks to the very accessible and publicly subsidized childcare services, the negative relationship between women's education and fertility actually weaken and eventually disappears over time. And another interesting example in contrast is in the American societies where there's little or almost no government subsidies for childcare, where everyone has to pay for the private childcare. They observe a U-shaped relationship whereby among the college-educated women, you actually see a positive relationship between education and fertility, because the really highly educated women with postgraduate degree actually face a lower cost of purchasing childcare services relative to their income. So among this group of women, you actually see a positive relationship between the two. So more broadly, it's not just access to childcare, but rather whenever women's roles as workers and mothers are more compatible, we should expect to see this negative relationship between their education and fertility to be weakened or even reversed. So in addition to access to childcare services, literature has also talked about how labor market institutions could make women's roles more compatible. Also importantly, if there are more egalitarian relationships and divisions of labor at home, then these new theories of family demography also suggest that it could also mean that a more compatibility between women's two roles. So in summary, we see that we don't know for sure how education would affect either of these pathways, which makes it a very interesting empirical question to explore. So in this study, I will draw on the data from the China General Social Survey. It's a repeated cross-sectional data. I'm using the way from 2010 through 2012. My analytical sample are women born between 1971 and 1989 who were aged at least 23 years old at the time of the survey. And I link the survey data to provincial level data from the Chinese statistical yearbooks. So here's just a very basic descriptives of my main X variable and the outcome variable. You can see that my sample of women has an average education of about 10 years, and then consistent with what we understand about fertility in China. Among this sample of women, you have on average only 1.2 children not ever born among this sample. So one contribution of this study is the analytics strategy. So here our challenge is that we want to explore the relationship, the effects of education on number of children ever born, but this relationship is confounded by many observed and unobserved factors, as I have just talked about. So one classic strategy to find out this effect is to find a variable Z that kind of exerts exogenous change to education. So this variable or this natural experiment should only affect women's fertility outcomes through affecting their education. And it should kind of exogenously affect their level of education. So in this case, this natural experiment I found is China's higher education expansion. So a bit background on the China higher education admission process. So every year, students usually at the end of their high school have to sit through a nationwide college entrance exam. It's a very high stakes standardized testing. So before you sit at the exam, the there's a kind of admission quotas being determined before the exam on how many students each university and each department would admit that year. And then after the exam, according to the actual performances and rankings, a cutoff score would be determined for each program that students apply to, and then that would then determine whether you get into the program you want to get into. So in June 1999, right before the exam, maybe a month before the exam of that year, the government suddenly announced that we are going to increase the admission quota that year by as much as 44% just from the year before. So you see a large jump here between from 1998 to 99. And then this kind of sudden expansion actually was sustained all the way through 2007. So between 98 and 2007, we actually saw a 5-fold growth in number of admissions to tertiary education in China, from 1 million to 5.6 million. Probably something you can only see in China. So in this case, I use this policy change as my natural experiment, as the variable Z here that kind of exogenously affects women's education and only affects their fertility through affecting their education. So more specifically, my identification assumption is that women's education should increase more in provinces where the education expansion is more intense. So here I use two sources of variations induced by this policy change in women's education. One is the change over time, as I have just shown, the huge increase just within a year. More specifically, I can define 3 cohorts of women according to their age in 1998. So for those who were aged below 18, they really benefited from the education expansion, because if you think on average at age 18, you sit at the entrance exam. So this is the treated cohort who really benefit from the expansion. I also have the control cohort who were already aged 23 or above when the expansion happened. So this control cohort have already missed the expansion. I also define kind of an in-between partially treated cohort, because there are a few cases where students can sit at the exam the following year if they are unsatisfied with their performance during their first attempt. There's also some variations in age of school entry and grade repetition. So it's not strictly that everyone is age 18 when they sit at the exam. So this partially treated cohort are those who might have benefited from this policy change. So the second source of variation is the intensity of this expansion, which varies by province. So one nice feature in the Chinese system is I can identify which province a given individual has taken his or her exam by their hukou province, which is the household registration system in China, which assign you a province. So this hukou province was really hard to change even when you physically move. So as you are probably familiar, even for migrant students who move to the cities, they still have to go back to their hukou province to take,
So Shuang, just a clarification question. Are you going to show us the average age at first birth in China and the high school completion rates in China so that we understand how this works?
Oh yeah, I have those in my paper. Okay. I'll show you this later. The high school rate, I think I showed you before, was 80% about recently. Okay, so this hukou system allows us also to identify the intensity of the expansion that a particular woman is exposed to. So using these two sources of variations, again, my assumption is that you should see more increase in women's education in provinces where the education expansion is more intense. For those of you who are interested in the details of how this is implemented, it's instead of a simple platform model showing the correlation between education and the number of children ever born, we add a first stage where we use the interaction between the cohort and the intensity as instrumental variables for women's education. I also add province fixed effect, cohort fixed effect, and some covariates to address potential violations of the identification assumptions. So I'm going to present the results. So first of all, we want to check whether it is a valid analytic strategy. Particularly, is it true that women's education increases more in provinces with more intense expansion? Here is a graph showing plotting the scatter plot of the intensity of the expansion versus the increase in women's years of education. So each dot represents a province. So the orange dot showing you how the intensity of expansion relates to the change between the control and the partially treated cohort. And then the green square show you the relationship with the change from control to treated cohort. So you can see, and then the lines are fitted using the model. And it's great to confirm that yes, women's education does increase more in provinces with more intense expansion. And this relationship is stronger when you compare control group with the fully treated group than if you compare the control group with the partially treated group. So just to make sure we're not just eyeballing the relationship, here are the actual coefficients. We're basically precisely representing the slope of the lines that I just showed you. And importantly, the F statistics are all above 10, telling us that indeed the instrument is relevant. And then I also checked several other assumptions required for higher education expansion to be a valid instrument. These include that also I find that not only does the expansion affect the probability of completing tertiary education, it also increase attainment at the preceding levels of education, including high school and middle school. Importantly, we want to make sure that the instrument is really exogenous. So I show in various ways that in the absence of the expansion, the trends in women's education are actually the same between the high intensity and the low intensity provinces. We also want to make sure that this expansion only affects fertility through women's education. So I use several tests to rule out that it does not, to make sure that it does not affect women's fertility by affecting men's education, by affecting quality of education, or any direct effect from the expansion. So all of this just to reassure me that this is a valid instrument and I can proceed on to my second stage. So the main outcome is we want to see the effects of education on the number of children ever born. So according to the Poisson model with the instrumental variable, I actually find that each year of education, women's education, increases the number of children ever born by 10%. So in this table, I show if you just using a Poisson model showing the correlation, it's very much the same as what we know from the previous literature that more educated women have fewer children. But this relationship flips to positive as soon as you take into account the endogeneity of women's education. So what does this 10% in terms of average marginal effects is equivalent to an increase each year of women's education increases women's number of children ever born by 0.14. More specifically, it reduces the probability of having no children by 3 percentage points, while increasing the probability of having 2 or more children by 4 percentage points. So this flip from the negative correlation to positive effect in the IV model is consistent with what we understood about the bias from the endogeneity of women's education. The effect sizes from my causal estimates are also very much similar to the study from continental Europe, which also showed positive causal effects of women's education. Importantly, it's important to note that estimates using this kind of strategy is giving us a so-called local average treatment effect, which means it's the effect on women who obtain more education because of the expansion, or it's the increase in women's education induced by the policy change. And it's not all women, and we know from previous literature that women who are influenced by such supply-side education expansion tend to have relatively high returns to education, and then they're more likely from the more developed regions, urban areas, and of ethnic majority. Even though this effect cannot be extrapolated to the whole population, it's actually more useful for the policymakers who want to think about, if I were to implement a large-scale Big Bang education expansion in a different context to induce change in women's fertility, what's the effect size, or what's the effect I can expect? So this is how this can be interpreted in a way. So I also examined the two mechanisms. The first is effect on age at first marriage. And I find that actually education does not cause the mean age at marriage to increase among women. Again, if we only look at the association, it's consistent with the previous literature that more education associated with later age at first marriage. But this change in science means that when this effect disappears, which tells us that this association is almost entirely due to the endogeneity of education. Now, you might be very surprised how education does not cause any change in the mean age at first marriage. So here I examine further the effect of education on the probability of getting married by specific ages. And here this graph shows you that education does significantly reduce the probability of marrying before age 15 and 18. So there is a reduction in early marriage. However, those who postpone marriage catch up immediately as soon as the additional years of schooling are finished. That's why you see actually a slightly positive effect around age 22. So this delaying effect coupled with the catch-up effect together tells us why overall we don't observe causal effect of education on the mean age at marriage. And actually some other studies set outside of China also show that even though there is negative effect of education on early marriage, it does not necessarily extend to later years. So a second mechanism is the effect of education on women's demand for children. Here I measure demand by the survey question asking, in the absence of the one-child policy, how many children do you wish to have? And because there could be measurement errors due to people who already had more than one children or two and rationalizing their decision saying, yes, I want two. Or there are still variation in eligibility to have two children. So to account for these measurement errors, I also use a binary variable derived from the same question to look at whether or not they demand more than two children. So both outcomes kind of tell us that among ever married women, education does increase not only their demanded number of children, but also the probability of demanding more, two or more children, more than two children. So some additional analysis supporting why education has a positive effect on women's demand for children. So consistent with our theoretical framing, I showed that education increases ever married women's non-wage income, both measured directly by their non-wage income, but also indirectly by their spouse's education. A second thing is I showed that this increased income actually did not lead women to withdraw from the labor market. On the contrary, education not only increases these women's demand for children, it also increases their likelihood of participating in the labor market and increases their earnings. So this means that it is not only the income effect, but something about education also allowing women to better combine work and family. So therefore, you see not only an increase in demand, but also increase in their labor market outcomes at the same time. So I ruled out several alternative explanations for this outcome. For example, is it because more educated women are less subject to social desirability bias when they're answering fertility desire question in the context of China? And I showed that it's not the case. And then is it also possible that a certain education expansion actually increases employment and decreases the wage premium? As we have seen, this is also not the case. And then I also checked that, well, maybe women's higher demand for children will be meaningless if they don't get to make decisions on childbearing anyway within the family. Then I further show that actually education does increase women's resources relative to their husbands too, which suggests that not only do they have higher demand for children, they're probably more likely and more able to achieve this demand. So altogether, in summary, my analysis so far show, first of all, each year of women's education induced by the higher education expansion increases their number of children ever born by 10%. And this positive causal effect is explained by two mechanisms. First of all, I showed that education does not increase the mean age at first marriage. Second, among ever married women, education increases their demand for children. So what does this positive effect of women's education mean for Chinese policymakers? Most directly, it means that fertility would have been even lower in China without the major progress we have seen in women's education during the same period. Second of all, it actually gives us a somewhat optimistic message that the current low fertility in China may not be entirely irreversible. Particularly, I showed that education in this case raises women's demands for children by raising their income and potentially reducing the work-family conflict that they face. However, it also tells us that merely allowing women to have more children probably will have very limited effect on their actual childbearing. What we need is more measures to directly support families and to actually reduce the conflict that women face between their roles as mothers and as workers. Now, is this positive effect of women's education unique to the Chinese context? I argue that it's likely not unique. First of all, I cited one study in continental Europe that shows a very comparable causal positive effect of very similar effect sizes. Even with the cross-sectional evidence from recent studies in Europe, we're actually seeing more educated women these days in certain countries in Europe or in certain sub-regions of European countries, more educated women having higher cohort fertility, higher rates of second or higher order births, and higher fertility intentions. And not just in low fertility Europe, studies from other low fertility developing countries such as Brazil and Thailand also confirm this general conclusion that with better compatibility between women's employment and child rearing, you actually see this associated with more births in these other developing contexts too. So of course, we need more future study to see how exactly this, whether and how this effect generalizes to other countries. But I think I just want to bring everyone's attention to the fact that actually nearly half of the world population nowadays live in a country or area with below replacement fertility. And you might be very surprised by the list of low fertility countries here, which include China, US, Brazil, Bangladesh, Russia, Japan, and Vietnam. So all that is just to say that low fertility challenges are no longer confined to the developed world, which means that we should better understand its effects and causes in these other contexts. Thank you very much.
For those who get seasick easily, close your eyes because we shall relocate the camera. Because if you are behind the camera, it doesn't catch what you say. Well, thank you very much, Shuang. And it is open to the audience. Stephen and the second, and Berkeley, the first two.
Hi, great talk. Thank you. Very interesting, very clear. I just had a couple of questions of clarification and a couple of observations to ask. First, in the Chinese context, do many people have kids outside marriage or before marriage, which is also a question, meaning I don't know what marriage means in China. Yeah. Secondly, you talk about number of children ever born, but I don't know how you observe that in the data, the CGSS. Thirdly, the IV Poisson headline estimate actually seemed to be not very precise. So I was wondering, certainly relative to the other one, so I was wondering what the confidence interval actually was before I wanted to put much emphasis on it, and whether or not it included 0. And then fourthly, years of education is your primary variable that you tell the story in terms of, which is fine, though it's a bit American-like for me. No, I mean, I'm interested in heterogeneity of the late, in particular, different types of educational expansion. To me, there's a big difference in terms of an expansion from primary to secondary and from secondary to tertiary. And I suspect there might be different effects in there. And I wondered if you'd looked at those sorts of heterogeneity. Thank you.
So thank you so much for the great talk. You kept answering my questions slide after slide, so I was very satisfied throughout the talk. So that was a fantastic job. I had one of the questions that Stephen asked. So my main clarification question was about, we want to see the age at first birth in general in China. If the teenage fertility is high, the people do have any children before they go to the college and so on. So that was one of the contextual things that we want to start with, seeing where on this treatment actually is affecting on the life cycle. The second thing is, I was quite interested in this literature because this is one of the most crowded literature in demography, population economics, and all of these fields, and then you cross-cite them across economics and demography. One of the things that I have known in this literature, that there are quite a lot of causal studies are also taking place in Taiwan and Korea and like other Asian contexts, which are even lower fertility contexts than China. And some of them were there, some of them weren't there. And most of these studies, like yours, and also one in Turkey that we cite in one of the citations, look at the education expansions that is happening at the high school level. So you have a slightly different treatment where education expansion is happening at the college level. I thought that it would be nice if you can frame your work as distinctive from the rest of these expansion stories where compulsory schooling expansions have been used as an instrument. In your case, you use the higher education expansion as an instrument. That would distinguish your work from the rest of the literature, and also could tell us a bit about the meaning of that treatment more so in going forward. So that's a comment.
Should I respond? Thank you both for the comments. So there are very few cases of extramarital birth in China, which makes my research easier. In a way, similarly to Berkeley's question, very few teenage births. If you look at age at marriage, or at least the recorded teenage births, so extramarital cases are very few, and people are still getting married. So you don't see, although it is increasing, but it is not a normative thing to see people cohabit in the same sense as people in Europe cohabit, or the cohabitation, even though increasing, would eventually lead to marriage sooner or later. The age of marriage is also pretty much, is kind of unlike many other East Asian countries. Age of marriage is very concentrated in like 10-year age period. And then like by age 30, pretty much everyone is married. Of course, recently you see more and more, maybe an increasing proportion of highest educated women and lowest educated men finding it difficult to marry. But overall, that's the picture. So children ever born is really just how many children do you have. So it is a different measure from cohort fertility. So if this is the effect we find in number of children ever born, then we would imagine the effect is even stronger on cohort fertility if we could actually observe at the end of the childbearing cycle after everyone has been
Born to date, then, current. I misunderstood.
Yeah, so yeah. Yes, I guess comment to all the IV estimate, it becomes less precise, but for my conclusion, it still generates very statistically significant outcome estimates in my case. However I plot the confidence intervals or using average marginal effect. And then for the level of education, I think the most interesting thing about higher education expansion, as I have briefly mentioned, is that when you expand the admission quota on tertiary level, it does not only influence your chance of getting a college degree, it actually influences your education decision down the line. So you see in my paper that with the quota of tertiary education increasing, these women are also more likely to complete middle school and high school. So I'm not just showing the effect of having a college degree on fertility, but kind of increase in year of education that happened from secondary through tertiary altogether. And I did have some analysis doing by separate levels instead of years, and it generates a very consistent result with this continuous measure. So I didn't present those separately. But it is definitely interesting to think hopefully once we accumulate more studies like this, then we'll be able to tell whether expansion at different levels would have different effects, or even expansion of like vocational versus general education would have different effects. But so far, I think even with this basic measure, the evidence is so few, but I would love to do more of that. Yeah.
Tim, and then I put myself on the list. And
thanks, Timo. Thanks so much, Shuang. That was really fantastic, really clear, and it provoked lots of thoughts in my own mind. I'm still wondering about the role of the one-child policy and how that interacts, especially so your data from 2010 to 2012, and you talk about kind of a gradual easing starting in 2013 of the one-child policy. And a lot of things come to my mind and try to figure out how you're able to separate out the effect of, say, there are plenty of people anticipating a change in the policy in advance of 2013. So, how you're able to control for that, right? Why it was, how you can say with certainty that that's not driving the increase. And I guess the other related question, and I'm trying to figure out how to say this most clearly, it's not super clear in my own head, but I guess it's the fact that you have, insofar as women might have been having children before, any formal repeal, of the one-child policy and incurring, fines or some sort of costs. I mean, they would have to have been making, it had to have been the more educated, better off women anyway, in order to have those children. So I guess I'm not suggesting that the higher education is having an effect, but I'm wondering about how you can tease those out, if at all.
Yeah. Sure.
Let's always do two, otherwise you
Okay.
get too. I have a question on one of the comments you made. Kind of education increases women's earning, and you said as a mechanism this could allow women to better negotiate the children they wish to have, so basically persuade their spouse. I wondered also, as an alternative mechanism, whether it allows families to better cope with the direct costs of children if there is more family income. And Anderson Kohler argued that in the East Asian context, the demand for education, the high costs of private education was suppressing fertility. So if you have higher family income, you might be better able to cope with that. And Berkey mentioned kind of different country case studies, and they showed that in those Korean regions where there is less spending on private education, you observe higher fertility. So then they make this linkage between low fertility and the East Asian education fever. And I wonder how this fits into your story, how you work with those costs of children.
Okay, great questions. So first, Tim's question is the main question from all the peer reviewers I've had. So far, I've done numerous sensitivity analysis just in response to your question on, is it one-child policy contaminating everything? So I think I can confidently say now, after all these sensitivity analysis that I have to do, that it is not. And one main concern is, for example, maybe it is provinces with less strict one-child policy that also have more education expansion, and then you see more children born. But the empirical data show you the opposite. It's the more strict provinces have higher expansion, so they shouldn't have more children if it is the one-child policy effect. Similarly, so the things like that is showing, as far as this identification strategy is concerned, it's not driven by the one-child policy. But also it's important to note that by 2010, so even in the 1990s, the research showed that only a third of the population were subject to very strictly one-child policy. And then by 2010, actually in almost all the provinces, like if you are both only children, you and your spouse, you're already allowed to have 2 children. So it was already a period when kind of a large proportion of the population was able to have children. And probably if you think about the political economy, depending on where you are, the paying fines and the violating policy probably has also slightly changed meanings by that point already in comparison to, say, in the 80s. And then Timo's question on how income work. Yeah, so I purposefully leave the word cost to mean a very broad range of costs. I think normally people would immediately think about direct costs first, like the cost of education and stuff. But the kind of thing I talked about, like women's fear of losing their career opportunities, or like these other things, to me also counts towards cost. And in fact, is less talked about when people are doing some sort of accounting of the cost of children. So the framework, the theoretical framework I use, at least I think encompasses all these different kinds of costs. And I also cited studies where they directly survey parents in China and to have them list what are the costs you associate with having children. And all these different types of costs are actually mentioned, like the private tutoring, the education costs, but also women's own, the consequence on women's career is also to people themselves count towards cost. But and not to mention, I mean, there are various things going on in the Chinese society now, and all that certainty and concerns and stuff that all kind of adds to the cost of having children at the moment, I think.
Yeah, the two first.
Thanks, great presentation. I have two sort of questions which are not completely formed, but I'll throw it out and I'll hope that you can make some sense of it. First is with regards to the impact of this natural experiment. So, I'm trying to sort of make sense of a similar experiment if it takes place in India. If you suddenly increase the amount of students that could get a position at a university, that would not be uniformly absorbed across the population.
Yeah.
So certain groups of people would occupy or capture that more than other. You have had a significant sort of increase. So I'm assuming that some of it would quote unquote trickle down to different groups, but it could still be stagnated at some group level.
Yeah.
I was wondering how that interacts with the result that you show. Second bit is sort of in terms of the cultural context of the market of childcare. So in India, the market around childcare would be more concentrated in certain spaces. And there is also sort of negative and positive thinking around sending your child to childcare that could exist. So that affects the demand of children in terms of the cost, in terms of the time for the woman. I wonder if you accounted for that in and if that exists, if there's a variation across China in terms of thinking around childcare.
Thank you so much, and it's really impressive. So one of my major concern for that is just if you can show us more evidence for how strong the environment the IV instrumental variable is, and I think that may be concerned a lot, especially how can you define its exogenous factor compared with other factors, because in parallel with that pattern, actually the Chinese society has changed so much in multiple aspects, not only for this singular or specific policy change, but also really a lot of social cognitive change in many different regions and in a lot of variety extent. And in addition to that, for the data sets that you used, I also quite familiar with CGSS, and I think so. Although CGSS is a populational based data set, but as far as I know, it seems like it didn't randomly selected the points when it was sampled.
Sorry.
Actually, the places, it seems like for me, they randomly select about 100 countries in China, but rather they selected based on province. So quite a lot of provinces, they are not related, not involved. So did that study have any any influence on your results, on your
Thank you for these great questions. So first is yes, education expansion only affects certain groups, not everyone, or affects certain groups more than the other. So that's exactly the local average treatment effect. So this effect is the effect on women who are affected by the higher education expansion. So if I am a girl who wouldn't go to university anyway, no matter how many admissions are provided, then I'm not part of this. This effect wouldn't apply to me because I'm not good. Like this experiment does not affect me in any way. Similarly, if I go to college, no matter what, regardless of how big the quota is, I'm also not affected by this change in policy either. So this effect is defined to be only among those who are impacted by higher education expansion. And the culture of sending children to childcare is a great question. So I think the Chinese context is very different from most of the other countries because we were a socialist country transforming into a market country. So just decades ago, when we were still a socialist country, childcare is all provided for almost free or no cost to everyone by employers or by local communities. So everyone was in childcare. There was no work-life, work-motherhood conflict for my mom. So it is kind of the reverse. It's with the market reform, suddenly these things are no longer provided for free. And then now you have to pay for it. You have to find ways to access it. So in that sense, culturally, it's not like some women are not okay with the idea of sending children. I would say more so probably pretty much vast majority is comfortable with that because that's where they came from. So it's kind of the reverse. Similarly, like, because in a lot of the European countries and the US, the major trend is actually the increase in women's labor market participation. So it's from women staying at home to going into the labor market. But in China, women's labor market participation in the socialist days were almost 90% or higher. So you recently see that actually decreasing to 80%. So then again, like this wasn't really a norm of like women staying at home, taking care of children, have to think about, it's kind of a new thing for middle class mothers to be worried about, I'm a bad mom, I'm not taking care of my child. But I hope that answers some of your questions. So for the instrumental variable, so the strands, I showed the F statistics showing that it is relevant. I did several tests to show that it's exogenous. One thing is, yes, many things were happening in China at the same time. That's why I'm using 2 variations rather than 1. I'm not just comparing cohorts of women over time. I also required the change to vary by which province they're from. So you could have multiple policies happening, but the intensity of this policy is not the same as the higher education expansion. For example, one-child policy reform is happening to the same cohorts of women, but the intensity actually varies in a different way. Another kind of placebo experiment I did is to look at women, actually just older women, who both cohorts of women shouldn't have been affected by this policy at all, and then look at without the policy, was there any change in their education? And there is no change in their education. So if there were other things going on, these other things should have affected their education even before this policy happened, but that's not what I'm finding. So these are kind of the direct and indirect tests I did to make sure that it is a valid instrument. And then I think, yes, maybe the more recent waves of CGSS cover a limited number of countries, but the 3 waves I drew on all together actually covered almost all the provinces.
So you mean you actually covered both from 2010 to 2012?
Yeah, I pulled them all together.
Oh, I see.
So.
Lucinda?
Thank you. Really great presentation. This probably comes over as a sort of a very naive question, but I'm thinking that you were estimating the sort of the causal effect of education, but you had that switch, didn't you? So the correlation is negative, but the causal effect is positive. Mm. So I just wondered whether you could say what that means. So are you able, I know you're looking at the mechanisms for the causal effect, but can you say something about the sort of what that implies about the endogeneity that's giving us this negative correlation? Yeah. And then just a little bit of the follow up on the cost discussion. I mean, you've sort of partly already answered it because you showed it affected both the probability of having any children and also the probability of having 2+. But I was wondering if there was something also potentially about the marginal cost of an additional child being in somewhere in there that makes a difference.
In the same line, well, fantastic presentation. In the same line, I was wondering what the policy implications would be, because you I think successfully challenged like a popular narrative, but from a policy perspective, it wouldn't be that intuitive to, for example, manage low fertility through education.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So, yeah, the switch from correlation to the causation is a typical thing that economists present in those kind of paper, mainly to actually confirm that education is endogenous. So one way is this is showing us, okay, education is endogenous, or this correlation is spurious. And then the other is to help me check whether the direction of the bias is as expected. So when I was setting up the study, the various ways people make decisions about education and fertility, and then this reverse causality between the two, all suggested that the correlation should have overestimated the negative impact of education on fertility. And this is what I'm seeing from this switch, because in all the tables, I see the effect switching from a negative effect to no effect or positive effect, which confirms that the correlation is a spurious relationship that has overestimated the negative effect of education.
Yeah, no, I get that, but I'm trying to think of it. It's sort of in tangible terms.
Oh, yes.
You know, you said something about the possible reasons why there would be endogeneity, and I just wondered whether you had any.
Yes. So basically, when you observe more educated women having fewer children, you should not jump into the conclusion that it's because education causes women to have fewer children. The main reasons, as I said before, I think are two main things. One is people would have factored in the effects on fertility and family formation already when they made education decision, especially in a resource constrained context. Like China, and particularly in rural China, there's direct evidence that fathers think, oh, I don't want my daughter to be at a disadvantage in the marriage market, and therefore I don't want her to get more education. So that's a very strong, so judging from the result, that is a very strong confounding force in this context that have confounded the correlation between more education and fewer children. But also the reverse causality is very strong too, because we all know that fewer children would lead to, more children would lead to you dropping out of school earlier, or even the intention of having more children would have led someone to stop their education earlier. So that's another strong force that's underlying this negative correlation, which is potentially spurious, I think. And then it would be nice if I could actually separately look at, like, from going 0 to 1 children, or 1 to 2, or 2 to higher. I was only able to get that when I'm doing the average marginal effect of the overall estimates. I do show that the main effect is through both reducing the probability of having no children and actually increasing the probability of having 2 or more children. So this result is very consistent with other studies showing that China's low fertility these days is actually driven by people not having children at all, but somehow offset by this other group of population who are having 2 or more children. So these two kind of together shows a somewhat low, but not extremely low fertility yet. And then for Visante's policy implication, yes. So the reason I really care about disentangling the mechanisms is precisely to generate meaningful policy implication, because the idea is not for every country or China to do another crazy Big Bang education expansion, but by showing that how this education expansion affects fertility, I can hopefully tell policymakers without a drastic education expansion, maybe you could provide measures that address the income concern and the conflict between work and family. So these are more attainable goals for policymakers.
The last question coming from Johan.
Yo-Yo, I shared the room's assessment. This was a really clear, persuasive paper. Thank you so much. It was a real treat to listen to it. Thank you. While I was listening to you, one of the things that I was kind of trying to piece together, reading between the lines, is what is Yo-Yo's theory of education? Because you've got a really kind of elegantly hypothesized set of mechanisms going on from education through to age at first marriage, demand for children, through to fertility. But while I was listening to what you think education does, I could hear kind of two sets of things happening. One was to repurpose some criminological language that's either an incapacitation effect or a deterrence effect, that while someone's in education, they either can't have kids or they're being disincentivized from having kids. And on the other hand, the other thing that I'm hearing you think education does is this is the Gary Becker argument, that there's a human capital point, that people are able to set themselves up for labor market success through their education, such that that's going to have create incentives and disincentives for whether or not they end up pursuing parenthood. But if I'm right about that's kind of the way you're thinking about what education does, then one inference that I just kind of wanted to share is that your talk made me think of, is that this needn't be education per se that's doing this work. I mean, I can't think off the top of my head of another social institution that does those two things. But what I'm hearing is it's those two things rather than education that's doing it. And I just wanted to share, that's one of the things that was reverberating through my head while I was listening to you talk, that this needn't actually be education. Right.
It doesn't.
Prison will do.
Prison will
It doesn't. So I purposely use this framework to say that education only affects fertility through these pathways. Of course, I welcome suggestion of any direct impact that doesn't go into these graphs. So Easterly's original framework did not concern education at all. He was just thinking about determinants of fertility. So in his world, that's all the determinants of fertility. So what I am saying here is, to observe any education effect on fertility, it should affect these determinants of fertility. So that's how the framework is structured. But I'm really glad you mentioned this theory of what is the effect of education. And judging from my results, these two boxes seem to mainly imply the human capital effect or returns in the labor market, on one hand, and on the other hand, this mechanical postponing effect, just like life course transition. You're in education, you can't do other things. But the most interesting finding to that point is reviewers really did not believe that education has no effect on age and marriage. There's got to be something. Education got to affect women's ideals or like views of marriage in a way that it should kind of delay it, but it does not. It only delays to the extent that women have to complete these additional years of education, but as soon as they finish, they catch up. So that to me is actually one of the most interesting findings from my study. So yeah, I mean, I'm not denying education could play all these other roles in other contexts, but as far as this finding is concerned, it seems that what I'm getting here, the main impact on fertility is through the labor market returns. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, and then also, I also thought the power dynamic between couples was not examined in this study, which actually is a very important area for examination in the future studies. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, John, for your presentation. I think it was appreciated and enjoyed by everybody here. And next week, we encourage the online audience to join us again. It's very quiet this week, surprisingly. Next week, we are having another hybrid talk with our speaker being far away in Canada. Cynthia Crawford will present from Toronto. She has published recently a book on home care fault lines, and she will be giving us a talk on that book. She has published drawing on about 300 interviews about in-home care, which will be shared by Isabel.